the Fundamentals of Lute Playing. My name is Laudon Schuett, and today we're going to talk a bit about how to go about learning a piece of music. I did a previous episode on how to practice, which I think was more of a general guideline about how to approach sort of practice in a grander sense. Today is going to be a little bit more of like the nuts and bolts of like how do you go about learning a piece of music. I should say that I don't think there is a single way to do this. I think everybody finds what works for them. I think if you look at the best players in the world, they all do things a bit differently because they've learned what works for them and what doesn't. They've pulled the things in that work. They've gotten rid of the things that don't. In some cases, they're just so good that they sort of doesn't matter. I think keep that in mind as I go through these steps, that this is not necessarily a you must do it, but this is a series of steps that I think is very helpful, and I don't think anything in this will end up actually hurting you. And you may find, even if you've got a really good practice method, that there might be some things in here that you can incorporate. I've said in previous lessons that efficiency is not really a goal, especially for a beginner. It's all about quality. We will talk about how efficiency can be helpful, both for amateurs and for professionals. And I think that can be paired with some ideas about quality control and some ideas about time management and all of those things. So we'll get into that in a little more detail. So let's say, for example, you have a piece of music. Now, how did you come about getting this piece of music? I think very often people hear a recording and they go, oh, I want to learn that Dalza piece, or I want to learn that Dowland piece, or maybe their teacher assigned it to them. And perhaps more rarely, I hear that people will go and they'll sight read through a book and they'll find a couple pieces they really like or a piece they really like. So however you found your piece, you found a piece of music. And I should say that I have a little breakdown of everything we're going to talk about in this episode today. And there is a link in the description so that you can download and print this out if you want. That will also save me in case I forget to say anything in this episode. There's just a lot to cover. So that way I can make sure that it at least is in writing. So grab that and come back and join us and we'll chat. So you've got your little sheets in front of you, and I think so. The first thing that I would say is you've got your piece of music in front of you. And what I usually do is I take a day or a couple of days to go and research the piece. So I'm not sitting down and immediately playing it, even if I've sight read it before. What I'm doing is I'm putting the lute down and I'm going, and it's amazing. We have the internet now. It's incredible. I mean, I'm old enough that I remember when the internet arrived in my neighborhood. So it's this incredible tool. You can learn a ton of things about a piece of music. But I'll use the first couple of days to go. If it's a dance, I'm researching the dance. I'm looking up what types of ornaments were used. I'm looking up biographical information about the composer. If it's anonymous, then I'm learning as much as I can about the source that it was pulled from. You know, is it a late 16th century Italian source? Is it a mid 16th century English source? Is it, an anonymous piece in between two John Johnson pieces? And maybe it's a John Johnson piece. So you start to learn as much as you can about the music. And at the same time, I'm going and while I'm doing this reading, I'm maybe listening, not necessarily to the piece, because I think sometimes if you want to learn a piece and you listen to a recording too much, you end up kind of taking on the characteristics of that other performer. But I'll be listening, for example, if I'm looking at Dalza or a Caparola or something like that, I might be listening to Frödele, so vocal pieces from the period or some other instrumental pieces from the period, and kind of immersing myself in the culture of the music that I'm about to learn. So I'm learning as much as I can. I'm reading, I'm listening. If you're a good sight reader, the other thing I love to do is, let's say you know who the composer is. Let's say you're doing Caparola. I'll read through pieces around the piece that I'm doing. You can learn some things about the notation system. You can learn, oh, this composer or arranger or copyist does certain things. The other thing I will use for this time, which I think not everybody realizes, but this is especially important with lute music, is I'll go and find as many versions of the piece as I can find to compare them. Because often there are many, many, many versions. You know, for example, like the Doland Lacrame is in a bajillion manuscripts. It's published, so you can lay it down side by side with other versions and go, oh, okay, well, I think, you know, this version is clearly a superior version, or this one has some issues, and you can sort of create a chimera from that. This period of preparation, research and preparation can go as long as you want. And obviously, as you're working on the piece, you can continue to listen and to incorporate things. I think I mentioned it here, you know, email experts. Go to lectures or watch lectures online about, you know, music from the period that you're about to learn. This is really, really helpful. So this is just sort of learning about the culture of the piece, and you can do this for a day, a couple days, however long you need to, and continue it as you're learning the piece. Now, the next step that I take is I sit down with the tablature, with the score, and I'll make a standard notation score. I'll sit down and I will actually, you know, write it out in standard notation in grand staff, so with a treble clef and a bass clef, and I'll go through and I'll write everything out. And again, this is not really with the instrument in front of me. If you're a beginner and you struggle with this, you may need the instrument to make your standard. You may need to go, oh, okay, C on the third course. Okay, what is that? Oh, yeah. Okay, that's this note, and you go through and you work it out. That's fine. As you become more experienced, I would say it's really nice again to not be holding the lute yet. I try to put off having the instrument in my hands and doing things with the piece until I'm really ready to go. Part of the reason for this is that if you make mistakes in the beginning, or you work out things that maybe aren't ideal and you learn them, then you have to unlearn them. So I try to avoid as much of that as possible. So there's a lot of preparation that I put in before I actually start to physically learn the music on the instrument. So I write out that grand staff notation, and I'm looking for things like imitation. I'm looking for ground-based patterns, pazzimezzos, and, you know, bergamascas and things like that. Usually they're easy to spot. Sometimes they're spread out, and it can be helpful to write it out and see that. But you're just getting a sense of the music. Without the instrument, you can also do this at the keyboard. I have a keyboard at home, and that's very, very, very useful. I think that's quite nice. And then what I'll do then is, once I have that standard notation score and I've got a sense of the music separated from the lute, I'll grab the tablature again and I'll have it kind of side by side with the standard notation score if I need it. And again, as you get more experienced, the less you will need the standard notation. There may even become a point where you don't really need it anymore. And what I would say is, if you can look at the tablature and you can say instantly, okay, C, okay, E, okay, B flat, okay, D, okay, C. You know, you're just going through and you know all of the notes, and you can read it as easily as grand staff. That may be a step that you are able to skip, and you can just read directly off the tablature. I would caution against doing that early, though. Make sure that you're very, very quick. So if you, for example, are looking at the tablature and you're going, this is an A, you're not ready. You're not ready. It needs to be, you know, F, C, or B flat. You know, you have to be able to just very quickly, that's what those notes are. Be able to name the harmonies. Oh, C major chord. Okay, B flat, got it. F, G minor. Once you're at that stage, then I think you can drop the standard notation score. And I will still use a standard notation score with like big complicated fantasies and things like that. If I'm doing a chromatic fantasy or a really nasty contrapuntal piece, I'll still sit down and do a standard notation score just to make sure that I don't miss anything. So the next step is I've got my scores in front of me. And what I will do is I will, with the lute, I'll sit and I will sing through the individual voices. I'll sing through the soprano voice, I'll sing through the alto voice, I'll sing through the tenor voice, the bass voice, and anything else that goes through. And I'm playing and singing at the same time. And what I'm figuring it out is, how do I want to shape and articulate these voices? So it's almost I'm taking the time to just think about it musically. I'm identifying rhetorical figures. If you haven't seen my episode on rhetorical figures, check that out. But I'm looking for gradatio, I'm looking for sonata mia, I'm looking for palologia, all of those things that I talked about. And okay, am I going to do a crescendo here? Am I going to do a decrescendo there? And I'm working with the individual lines so that I'm not there's nothing getting in the way physically. I'm not worried about playing a bass note at the same time. I'm not worried about big nasty chord shapes. Now, if you're an absolute beginner, playing a single line might still be quite challenging. And what I'll usually tell people is, if you're a beginner and playing a single line is still a challenging thing to do, remember throughout this whole process that chaining is very, very useful. And chaining is just, you learn the first note, you add a note, then you add another note, and you add another note as you go. So if you need to do that with the individual lines, you do it with the individual lines. And that's totally, totally fine. And you're going through and you're putting in some dynamic indications, articulation, anything that you think musically might be helpful. And then what I'll do after that is I might take pairs of voices. So I might take the soprano and the alto voice, or I might take a bass voice and a soprano voice, or bass and tenor. Something like that, and I'll go through and I'll put the voices together in pairs just to see how they interact and what little things you discover. You start to hear where maybe some of the dissonances are located, and some of the play rhythmically and all of that. I'm checking my notes here to make sure I don't forget anything. But I will do that with the pairs of voices. And then begins the process of fingering the piece. And I will spend a lot of time on this. I think I've mentioned this in previous episodes, but I'm a very good sight reader. So in some ways that's really wonderful, but it also means that I sometimes cheat myself in terms of really thinking out excellent fingerings. So when I'm putting these fingerings in, I actually turn my sight reading completely off. I pretend that I can't sight read at all. And I go very slowly, phrase by phrase, and I'm thinking about, okay, should I use this fingering? Should I use this fingering? Is there something I haven't thought about, something ridiculous with a bar? Thinking about, all the possibilities, and I go through very, very slowly. And I try to find the best possible fingerings that are going to work. Sometimes you will come up with some brilliant, wonderful fingering that keeps all of those musical decisions that you made with your individual voices. And I should say that is something that you're checking. You're putting your fingerings in, and you're making sure that the decisions you made about your individual voices, your crescendos, your articulations, if you're shortening a note, you're going to make sure that when you put your fingerings in that you're maintaining as much of that as possible. That said, it needs to work, and it needs to work at tempo, and it needs to work under pressure. So when I'm putting my fingerings in, and this may be really hard for beginners to do, but I will test them as close to tempo as possible. So if I'm doing something and I'm going, okay, I need to make sure that this works. Okay, what if I try that with 3? I don't like that as much, right? So I'm figuring out, I'm briefly playing fingerings at tempo, and it's okay if they're a little sloppy, if they're a little messy, but I'm briefly playing them at tempo just to make sure that they're going to work, that I'm not going to be wasting my time. And if you're a beginner and you're doing this, you may not be able to tell. And we'll talk about, you may just need to adjust your fingerings down the road because you're not ready to play it at tempo. Or you could also check with your teacher and say, is this fingering going to work? That can be very helpful. Fingerings, I'm putting in both left hand and right hand fingerings. I think it's important to be as detailed as possible. Some people are a little more loosey-goosey and it works for them, and that's great. I've been there. I've definitely been the loosey-goosey guy with both left hand and right hand. And as I get older, I just find out like the more precise I am, the more thoughtful I am about the fingerings, the better everything is going to go. So in general, I would recommend that you be very, very precise and be precise in your notation so that when we get to sort of the learning phase, you're not going, oh, wait, what did I decide to do? Am I going to use my middle finger for that strong note, or am I going to use my thumb? And you go, oh shoot, oh, I don't remember. So try to go through and be as thoughtful and careful about that as possible. And you may need to change fingerings, and we'll talk about that as we go along. As I'm putting these fingerings in, and as I said, I usually go phrase by phrase. I'm also sort of marking where the difficult spots are going to be. The spots that, especially as you become more experienced, you're going to be going, oh yeah, this thing is going to be hard. This is going to be a moment that impedes my playing, that stops me from playing this piece, and I'm going to have to tackle it. So I'm marking these spots, usually with a pencil. I just put little kind of repeat signs around it, or I put a little note that says, okay, this is a difficult spot. Again, if you're a beginner, you may not be able to tell what's good. Maybe it's all difficult, and we'll talk about that. I think for beginners, you're just going to be chaining through moment by moment, and you'll hit the difficult spots when you hit them, and you'll work them out like everyone else. But you may have more trouble identifying where they're at as a beginner, or you may think that everything is difficult, so you don't necessarily know where the worst spots are. So that gets us to, I think, the most complicated bit of all of this, which is once I've got my tablature fingered and everything is worked out, what I then do is I prioritize the difficult spots. And I talked about this a bit in my sort of episode on practicing. The philosophy here is sort of this idea of sort of deep end practice, which is it is to your advantage to tackle the difficult things first. And I mean that in a macro sense, but I also mean in a daily sense. So like when you sit down with your instrument, it's really good to, as soon as possible, start working on, you might need to warm up a little bit, but just get into the really nasty stuff while your fuel tank is full. So what I would say is, you've got your piece in front of you. You've gotten up. You've done whatever little warm up. If you do a warm up, you've gotten it done. You feel good. I would then dive in to these difficult spots that you have marked. And this is perhaps the hardest thing to, they're difficult to play, and they're also difficult for, I think, teachers to convey how to deal with them. And I'm going to try to do my best here. And what I would say is the most important advice I can give you about dealing with difficult spots is that you need to avoid frustration. You need to approach it. If you've ever played chess before, or you enjoy solving puzzles or doing crosswords or Sudoku or Go or something like that, you need to come at this with a sort of critical thinking, problem solving, puzzle solving attitude, and not this sort of, I've got to get through this. This is really hard. You will lose. It'll end up being a little bit like punching a wall. You're going to lose. The wall is going to win. And when dealing with difficult spots, there's sort of a step-by-step process that I go through, and I'll share that with you. I make myself as comfortable as possible. I make sure I've got my coffee or maybe some hot cocoa. I'm very chill about it. I've got the window open, so the birds are singing. It's a nice morning. I don't try to solve problem spots when I'm not in a good mental state to do it. So if you are having a rough day, I might not even bother working on hard spots. I would just wait till you're feeling good. When I sit down, and let's say I have a spot here. I'll show you a spot. There's a spot in a Dallin Galliard that I'm working on for a recording. And it goes something like this. I played it a little earlier. And it's not super hard for me, but it's really hard to get perhaps this quite as clean as I like. So I've got this spot, and let's say I've got this in front of me. I'm going, this is really hard. And let's say I'm not doing it really well at all. Say I'm going, and it's really falling apart. Okay, I need to learn this spot. So I'll sit down and I'll take a look at it. And the first thing I do is I figure out what moment is actually hard. Now, if I look at this spot that I've marked off and I go, okay, for me at least, none of that is difficult. Right hand or left hand, that's really not a problem. It's getting here. It's getting to this chord. So it's this moment from going from here to here. Okay, so the next thing I do is I look and I go, okay, did I really choose the best fingerings for this? 90% of the time, a difficult spot can be resolved by just being a little more clever about your fingerings, just understanding yourself a little better. Again, if you're a beginner, you may really struggle with this because you just don't know yourself that well. But it may be, for example, let's say my initial fingering that I wrote in was something like this. And I'm really struggling with that. I kind of pulled that off, but let's say I didn't. And I'm really having trouble with that fingering. I might go, okay, let's try the other fingerings again. Oh, that's nice. And maybe that solves it instantly. But let's say we go through the process, we go, okay, I think I've got the best fingerings. I really do, but it's still not working. It's still hard. And this is that last 10%, I think. And this 10% is, I think, what stops people from being able to play pieces. It's this, you get down to a moment, it's these 10% tiny little things that impede us. And sometimes there are a couple in a row, and legitimately you have to solve a couple in a row, and that's tough. I think this section actually does have a couple nasty little bits in a row, if I remember correctly. But so, and I know I've kind of already solved this section, but I'm going to pretend that it hasn't been solved. So I'm going through here, and I've decided this is really the best fingerings. Changing them isn't going to help. So how do I go about learning this? Now, the first thing that I usually do is I make sure that my destination, my landing point, is clean. So for example, can I play this chord clean? And if I'm playing it around and I go, there's some thunking, or maybe this finger is not landing on the right fret, or there's some stuff like that, what I'll do is I'll find the shape where it's clean. And one good thing you can do, if it's a chord, for example, play the notes separately, just to check. You go, okay, all right, I found that shape, and I'm going to take note of that shape. So now what I have to do is I have to go from here to this shape. And here's where things get interesting. There's a lot of talk about slow play. People say, well, play things really, really slowly. But you can do slow play terribly. You can play very slowly. Let's say I did this. And I did something like that. To me, I think the point of slow play is to give yourself enough time to think. So I'm gonna actually recommend that when you're dealing with a mechanical problem, when you're trying to get into a chord shape, you actually take it out of time. So what I might do is I recognize that the difficult spot is from here to here. So what I need to figure out, what I'm doing is I'm taking the time to look at, okay, so I need to prep these two fingers. These are the two that are going to be used in this chord. And then I need to move this bar up to the 5th fret. So I've got a couple things going on simultaneously. And as we said, this is not hard, so I'm going to ignore the notes that come before here. I'm just going to go from here, from this moment to here. And I might go crazy, crazy slow. not even in time. So I'm moving the bar up, and then I know I need to bring 2 and 4 down. Like that. So again, I'm not doing it in time. So once I think I've got it, and then I play it, and then I try it again maybe. Now the last thing I played was, yeah, index here. So I've got this finger down, I pluck this last note, and then... And the reason that's important is I want to make sure I'm also incorporating whatever my right hand did last, because maybe it's a right hand problem. So I'm going to go like this. And let's say that you really need to focus. You could isolate the left hand and just practice going from here to here. And there are a couple of things I'm taking note of, like I'm going to lift my third finger, I'm going to slide up or shift up, and then I'm going to put 2 and 4 down. So if you have unlimited time, you take it out of time, you're going to go shift, these 2 are going to come down, and I want them to come down simultaneously. We talked about this a little bit in the left hand episode recently. If you put one finger down and then the other, you lose a little time. Now, there are situations where you have to do that. I don't think you have to do it here, but there are situations where it's so complicated that you do have to do that. And there are some tricks to getting around that. Let's say, I needed a little extra time to put the top note down on a chord like that. I might roll the chord. And that gives me a little extra time. So there are some tricks to deal with that situation. But in this case, I'm solving the problem that's in front of me. I'm taking the issue that's in front of me and I'm trying to work it out. So what I'm doing is I'm just working on the mechanical motion and I'm analyzing everything that's going on. I'm thinking about my elbow, I'm thinking about my arm, with the hand, and I'm going like this. Okay, maybe what I do is I check to make sure is my right hand... There's really nothing hard in my right hand there, but if there were, that might be something I want to work on. And once I'm really comfortable doing this out of time, what I will do, and I'll do it right from the last moment, and I'll get everything set up. And I'll pop it in time to test it. And I know that sounds crazy to go from no time to popping it in tempo. And I do try to put it in tempo because I do want to find a solution that's going to work in tempo. Now, some people, that might scare them a little bit. That might be a thing you need to practice. You're used to maybe using the metronome and going slowly to fast. But for me, I find that I need to find out quickly whether this thing's going to work or not. And if it doesn't work, I go back to examining the mechanical situation. And of course, you can put that intermediate step. So if you need to, you could get back into time and go slowly. So you could do something like, I think these are eighth notes. You could go, and 1, and just do that slowly. As you become more experienced, I think you'll find that you can just test it at tempo most of the time. And I'm not a big fan of the metronome, but brilliant players use them. And I think if you need to use it, absolutely, you could practice it at a very slow tempo and then gradually build it up. Once you get more comfortable, though, I do recommend just taking the spot once you've got a mechanical solution and going, oh, okay, there we go. That works. And what I'll do is I'll test just the moment. And then I'll test it a little more in context. And I don't remember what comes next, but it's something like this. Yeah, I think that's it. And I'll kind of expand on both sides to see, okay, did I actually solve the problem? So you go through. Now let me see. So examine the movements of both arms and hands, making sure I didn't forget anything. Practice the motions out of time, incredibly slowly. And check your fingerings, that sort of thing. Now, this is especially important to professionals, or if you're an amateur and you have a performance coming up. If, for example, you've got a performance coming up in 3 days and this spot is not solved, accommodate. Make some little change to the music to make it easier. Maybe you do something like, I don't know, so we could do, you could move it here, right? You could change where the notes are at. Let's say it's just not working for you to move up here. You could do something like, you move here. And then you would change, maybe you could hop back there, right? So you start making changes, and let's say, oh, okay, it's still not working. Well, you take a note out. And if you need to take a note out, you take an inner voice out. For students, I usually say, like, try to solve the problem. And if the problem doesn't work, and you've been really, really working on it, and it's the only thing holding the piece back, fine. Then try changing the position of the note on the fingerboard, or notes. In this case, we've got this chord, which can be moved here, basically. Yeah. So we've got this chord, which we can move here. Now, if that's still not working, then we talk about removing a note. And I think the best note you would remove here would probably be the inner voice, the D there. So you could do something like, yeah, go. That brings its own problems, but let's say this is a solution that, yeah, there we go. And you could change where that is. You could take out a note. So that's accommodation. That is the sort of thing that if I have a gig in a day and I still haven't solved a problem, just do it. You want the performance to be as smooth and as beautiful as possible and as comfortable for the audience. So if you haven't solved a problem, make that change. If you don't have a performance coming up, I would try to work your way through it. Work with your teacher. Sit down on a day you're feeling really good and just play around with different solutions. And so I guess I'll summarize this, because I think these difficult spots are the things that once you're an intermediate level player or an advanced level player, these are the things that really get you. As a beginner, everything is hard, and it's kind of less applicable to you. But as an intermediate or advanced player, what I would say is that number one, try to be relaxed about problem solving. If you're running into issues, when I just changed those notes, I was like getting a nasty B flat there. So if you have that sort of thing going on, you just have to kind of think about it and be a problem solver. Oh, I just need to change the angle of my arm. If I try to keep my arm straight, I'm going to get a nasty sound there. So just be a critical thinker, a problem solver, and make sure that you're in a good mental space, you're having fun. And then, check your fingerings, make sure that they're absolutely, and recognize that if something is not working, repeating it over and over again is not going to fix it. You need to change something. You need to alter something. I like to joke with my students sometimes. I'm like, well, okay, if you go and you hit your head against a wall and you're like, oh, that didn't work. Okay, I'm going to hit my head against the wall again. Okay, that didn't work. You're never going to win. That wall is going to beat you. You're just going to hurt your head. You need to find some way around it. And whether that's a fingering change, whether that's a mechanical alteration, actually, this was a great example, because I had kind of on the fly changed the position of this chord, and I was having a little trouble actually getting it to sound good. So I might have a mechanical change, and that mechanical change is the angle of my hand. So trying to keep my hand like this wasn't quite working, and now that's working. So making a mechanical change, an angle of the arm, an angle of the fingering, the finger, examining, what are my fingers doing in the air? If I'm doing this and I'm getting to here and my pinky is flying out like this, then it's a lot more work to get it there. So controlling that pinky on its trajectory to its destination, thinking about the mechanics of the problem and making some slight alterations, taking it out of time, and really giving yourself a chance to look at what the fingers, the arms, the shoulders, everything is doing, and making that change. Now, once you've got a solution and things feel good, then repetition becomes useful, because then you can repeat. Let's say you've got a new solution and now now when you do a repetition, what you're doing is you're confirming a good habit. You're finding a way, and whether it's that or it's, and you might go through this whole the whole section bit by bit. And there may be several difficult spots in a row, and so what I'll do again is I'll chain. Chaining. When you're a more advanced player, I will use chaining for like these difficult phrases or sub phrases or spots because I might need to break a passage up. This passage obviously has a couple things that are challenging. We go here, and then we've got a move here, so I might need to work out each of those, and then we've got a move here. So chaining helps me just go, okay, one problem at a time. I don't necessarily need to do that in other places, but in the very difficult places, it can be helpful. So I try to tackle all of these problem spots before I start working on the rest of the piece. The one thing I'll say is I might play the opening phrase of the piece a few times just so I have the character and the tempo in mind when I'm working on these problem spots. I might sit there, the opening of this galliard is... So I have that in mind. So I have a general tempo and a general character to work on these problem spots in, so I can reference that. And if you're working on multiple pieces at the same time, I collect all of these difficult spots and I work on them first. I'll work on the problem spots in one piece and the problem spots in the next piece. And then as I start to get tired, let's say during my practice session, I'm getting tired and I'm just not in a good problem spot solving mode, which is, for me, it's very high energy. Hopefully I'm burning calories. Then what I do is I switch to working on like the easier phrases. I might go back to the first phrase. And if you're a good sight reader or you're a good reader or the phrase is easy, I don't think you need to necessarily do anything special other than really follow your fingerings. You might go through and go. And what I'm doing is I'm just spending some time with the phrase and I'm shaping it and I'm listening to it. If you find that to be challenging, you're like, oh, I can't play it at tempo. Chain it. So you can always go back to chaining. For a moderately difficult phrase, if you just are not a great sight reader, chain it. And I'm shaping the phrase and I'm figuring out, okay, making sure that I like the sound of it without any sort of external reference. And then once I feel good about the phrase, I record it. And I'll listen back to the phrase, and if I hear anything that I don't like, I make an adjustment and I fix it. I take care of it then. So that way I'm not learning the phrase for, a week, and then suddenly I record and I realize, oh man, what was I doing with that note? That really sucks. And obviously, if you have phrases that have these difficult spots and you haven't solved them yet, skip those phrases for now. Don't work on them until the difficult spot is resolved. Or if you do work on them, you stop before you get to the difficult spot, because we don't want a situation where you're ingraining bad habits. So you're going through and you're learning these phrases. Ideally, you have all your difficult spots solved, but sometimes you're kind of doing both simultaneously. It gets a little messy. So you solve all your difficult spots, and then you integrate them into the phrases, and now you're learning the phrases. And you're either just playing through them or you're chaining, if you need the chaining, and you're following your fingerings very, very carefully. And as you complete or you feel like you're comfortable with each phrase, you're recording and reviewing. And you just do this through the whole piece. And I think the other thing I'll say is that once I have a phrase feeling comfortable, I'll also test it in the context of the previous phrase. So I kind of string the two phrases together, kind of a macro level chaining. And once I've gone through and I've played the whole piece in phrases, I've recorded, I listened back, then the next step is I record the whole piece. And what I usually tell people is, like, you're not necessarily going for a perfect recording here. You're trying to get a sort of average recording of yourself playing this piece. And so I wouldn't do more than like 3 attempts. I maybe play it 3 times or maybe even just play it once if you're brave, and listen back, because what you want is an honest assessment. This isn't for releasing for public consumption. This is kind of like, okay, where is the piece now? Where are my problems? So you record yourself playing the whole piece, put the lute down, grab the score, go through and mark any spots. And there may be difficult spots that you weren't expecting as you go through and play. And again, if you run into those, you go back and you isolate them just like the ones that you did see. You listen to the whole recording and you mark any issues. Try to resolve those issues and maybe record it again and see, okay, I got rid of those issues. And then the standard you want to hold yourself to is, okay, is it at a point where I'm comfortable playing this in front of other people? I hate to use the word perfect because it's never going to be perfect. You're going to be sitting there and you're going to be doing recordings till you die. Like, I don't know any professional musicians who are 100% happy with their recordings. It's not the way it works. There's always going to be things, but listen back and ask yourself, okay, is this good enough? Is this like, I would be proud of playing this way in front of an audience? And you go, great. Now, you might think, oh, it's time to play in front of an audience. That's great. I'm ready to go. And I think a lot of sort of practice methods end here. But what I would say is, if you are a nervous performer, then there is another step I'd recommend you take. If you're not, if you're the kind of person who's like, I love going in front of people and I love playing in front of people and it's just no problem, ignore the next step. This is for people like me who maybe need a little bit more prep before they go and play in front of people. The next step is that I practice recreating the performance environment the best I can and playing the piece. I, for example, will take a look at what my body does when I'm nervous. I get kind of slightly shaky hands, I get butterflies, and I get a little cold. So in the apartment, I'll turn the temperature down. I won't eat before I play so that I get a little bit of those butterflies from the stomach and things like that. And then I'll put myself in a different part of the apartment and maybe even dress up a little bit, and I'll introduce myself. I say, "Oh, my name's Laudon Schuett, and today I'm going to play a Galliard by John Dolan." And then I'll sit and I'll play the thing, and I try to play it actually as uncomfortable as possible, so you get used to that discomfort. And then of course you ramp it up. You play in front of your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your husband, your wife, some friends, and things like that, and you start increasing it. Now, if you've done the recording, you've also practiced that kind of tension level. You've gone and you've recorded, and you turn the red light on. You go, oh no, I don't want to screw up. So there's a little bit of prep in that as well. But find out what your body does when you're nervous. If you're somebody who gets sweaty hands, I had friends who would put a little bit of oil on their hands to practice having that feeling. If you get hot when you perform, put on some extra sweaters, turn up the temperature in the apartment. But try to recreate that. And then, finally, the other bit of advice with performing I would give is that if you spend a lot of time learning a piece of music, and this happens a lot in music school, you might spend a semester or two or a year or two learning a piece, and then you play it once. And like everything is riding on that one performance. It can be very, very stressful. But what I found when I transitioned to the professional world, my first tour as a professional was with my lute duo, Bedlam, and we did like 5 concerts in a row in Chicago. It was like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And I was like a little nervous on Monday and Tuesday, but by Wednesday, I wasn't practicing. We maybe warmed up a little bit, rehearsed a tiny bit, but by Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, it felt great. So if you are a nervous performer, the other thing that can be really, really helpful is to just do a bunch of performances back to back with no break. And it just kind of starts to become normal. It's not scary. It's like when I go to a roller coaster park, and that first roller coaster I'm a little nervous about, but then the rest of the day I'm just jumping on the roller coasters and having a great time. So that's my advice to you. Again, I'll repeat that this is not a like you must do it my way. These are the steps you have to do to be a good performer. I think everybody finds their own way of doing things. Download the little packet that I've made available to you. Look it over, see if there's anything that's useful to you. And if you have other ideas, throw them in the comments. I'm sure people have a billion different things that they do, but I'm expecting that. And I think part of this is just exploring what works for you. And hopefully there's some things in here you find helpful. So with that, happy practicing, happy luting. If you're enjoying this series, one of the best ways you can support is just subscribe, like and subscribe. I also have a Patreon, which I put a link if you'd like to support in that way. It is there in the description. Have a wonderful week. I believe next week episode will be some tips on sight reading. So we'll be keep going and covering the exciting topics. Have a great day, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.